And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. The Tsimshian Roundtable is a unique partnership of 6 Tsimshian First Nations and LNG proponents located in Northwest BC. In 2016, the BC provincial government announced support to develop solutions to historic employment barriers for First Nations. President and CEO of Blackfish Industry, Chris Sankey, begins our show on today's Open Connection.
So I'm Chris Sankey. I'm from Lakwalams, which means Island of Roses. My ancestral name is Wadzine. It means the person that enters quietly. So I used to be elected official for Lakwalams for about 6.5 years. I was one of 4 negotiators for the Pacific Northwest LNG deal. At one point, we had $650 billion of proposed projects, P&W being the one that was contentious, fully aware. And then I was one of 2 negotiators that negotiated the first ever environmental monitoring agreement between BC, Canada, and the Coast Tsimshian. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territory of the Coast Tsimshian of Lakwalams, Malakala, and going into why I'm here. So I'm involved in energy, but more importantly, I decided to take on, I think, which is probably one of my most important initiatives that I've ever helped start, and that is the Tsimshian Roundtable. Last December, we had 6 of the 7 communities sign a protocol agreement to look at traditional knowledge, political risk, common interest, and a path forward. And I'm happy to say, after 2.5 years, this past Friday, the leaders finally got into why I wanted to start the table. And that's to talk about the tough issues: overlap, rights and title, energy. Pretty straightforward. So I kind of ripped the Band-Aid off last meeting to really get our leaders to really start talking about what is their issue, what is the issues that are bothering our communities today, and why is there so much fighting behind the scenes? And I was being very blunt, and that's the only way you can do it. And I said to the leaders that if you're going to solve your differences with your neighboring communities and internally, the only way you're going to solve these differences is if you get in a room and duke it out. Get in a room and have those tough conversations, the uncomfortable conversations. And I said, you got to be so uncomfortable that you become comfortable talking about these difficult issues, because if you don't, then our past will always be our future. That's just the way it's going to go. And so last Friday was probably one of the first meetings I heard them talk about what is bothering them. What are the issues of these communities, of why they can't seem to align with another. And that's the premise of what I'm doing. You'll never hear me talk about a project. You'll never hear me talk about a site. You won't even hear me talk about what's happening with the communities. But I will always talk about alignment. It's important that the Indigenous communities, wherever there's going to be a proposed project, that the leadership is aligned, that they must see eye to eye and be able to look at one another and figure out how to work together. And that's really what I'm doing. I don't talk for Indigenous leaders or communities, and I don't talk for industry. I am merely the bridge that bridges the gap of communication between leadership to leadership. I don't do anything fancy. And if many of you that know me, I'm very blunt. I've seen things now for the last 10 years transpire, 15 or so, I should say. And everybody kept dancing around these difficult issues, from oil and gas to nuclear to coal. What is energy literature? And I said this at the table on Friday. Don't be afraid to talk about oil, gas, and money. And don't be afraid to talk about what you're doing for the best interest of your community, even if it upsets your neighboring community. Don't. You have a right to an economic opportunity no matter who you are and where you're from, or the position or territory you grew up in. That doesn't mean a project's going to go forward. What it means is you're given an opportunity to get in front of one another to have these challenging conversations, whether it goes or not. But don't not show up. One of the lessons learned, when you don't show up at these big tables, you could lose out on a golden opportunity to get into some of the benefits before a project even goes, or if it even does go. People fail to forget, and the leadership now knows this because everybody that's at the table has been involved in big development. But people forget a lot of these big mega projects never go. 99.9% of them fail or they don't go forward. You take a look at LNGC today. I think they canceled for five years or so. But when I spoke to Alice, that project actually was in the works for 14, 15 years. You take a look at Woodside down in Australia, who actually was in, and I'll get to that in a bit, but it was just in Lima, Perth. And they canceled for 15 years. And then all of a sudden, 3 LNG facilities came on board. So going back to the leadership table, I think it's really important that it doesn't matter. And I keep saying this to the leaders, it doesn't matter the color of your race, the status you may come from, or where you grew up. What matters is you get in a room and solve your differences head on. And you're going to not like what the other person says. You're not going to like what the other person does. But at the end of the day, as long as you could agree to disagree and move forward together, because together you'll be stronger and you'll be way better at tackling these big energy initiatives, or whatever that may be.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Tsimshian Roundtable partners have been working together in 4 key areas for ongoing development: K-12 education, training and experience, recruitment and employment, and socioeconomic well-being of Tsimshian members. Let us return the conversation. Chris Sankey.
Whether it is small, medium, or big, at the end of the day, you have to talk about those tough issues. And that's why I started the leadership table. Now, it's 2.5 years or so. And I can tell you the leaders themselves have expressed multiple times, and I heard it being said up here, they want to work with all of their neighbors, not just with the Tsimshian. They want to work with the Nisga'a. They want to work with the Haisla. They want to work with the Haida. They want to work with all the nations. But alignment is key so that we have a foundation under the nation's table before we invite other nations to the table. Makes pretty good sense. But these are challenging times. And I know that so many people over the last 10 to 15 years, and again, I said this at the table on Friday and everyone agreed. We got so afraid to talk about oil and gas or anything energy. It was so demonized that you were even afraid to talk about it with your family. You were even afraid to talk about it with your neighbor, your friends, your brother and sister. When in reality, it's the energy sector keeping us alive and functioning as a society. Whether you're for or against or indifferent, it doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is you're at least in the room having these difficult conversations, because they're not going to go away. What matters is that you're at least having them. That's the important part about this whole process. And the outcome is based on the fact whether or not you could work together and make it happen. Because it doesn't just fall on our shoulders as Indigenous people and communities as leaders, but it also helps the greater provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and so forth. Canada in general. Now, I had the same talk in Lima, Peru, and I'm an advisor to the NOC committee, which is the International Gas Union, and as well as the National Gas Association as well. And I said, Indigenous communities aren't against development. They're against development when they're not involved. Indigenous communities are in favor of responsible resource development. I think, if anybody, at this day and age, given our history, for the last 10,000 years, Indigenous people have been in business for 10,000 years of that. If anybody knows the land better, it's Indigenous people who walk the very territory where we want to look at development. So who better to partner with? The other equation to that, and my statement, because in this room, there was 70 different country reps. There was multiple Indigenous people from South America at this conference. Is that you cannot fit a square peg in a round hole anymore. Engagement in early engagement with the impacted Indigenous communities on a global scale is front and center everywhere. It's not just here in Canada, But in fact, believe it or not, a lot of the countries that were there are taking Canada's example and lead of what to do, best practices, and then what not to do. Case in point, P&W was probably a prime example of what not to do. Now, do I blame the proponent? No. Do I blame the authorities that maybe pointed out the place? But at the end of the day, we didn't know at the time. I thought, maybe this will go. I actually literally did think it was going to go, but it didn't. Here we are almost 10 years later. All of these companies are coming back tenfold from around the world. They're constantly coming to this area, this whole Pacific Northwest area. Prince Rupert as a whole, with Kitimat, is deemed to be the low carbon future of port-related developments in the world. So everywhere I've gone to date, I was in the UK, I was in London, England just before, about 2 weeks prior to that. The EU, UK, France, Germany, they all want Canada product. Who better to partner with than Indigenous communities? That was the first thing they asked, actually. There was investors, there was industry players, and the one question they asked, are the Indigenous communities in Canada aligned? Working with another group out of New York. Everybody knows New York investment, Wall Street. And the funniest thing I ever heard come out of that conversation was their understanding of a band council resolution. This is Wall Street in New York, understanding what's happening on a global scale when it comes to Indigenous business and engagement. Wall Street. Bay Street's the same way. So it's important that we work together regardless of our differences. It's important that we sit down across one another, even if we disagree. Because where there are challenges and difficult conversations lies a solution for a path forward for everybody as a prosperous country and a prosperous Indigenous community. Now we ask government and we ask industry to play ball with us. We ask government to get out of the way so we can prosper and start managing wealth and not poverty, so we could have intergenerational wealth transfer for the next 7 generations. I believe industry is doing that. Investment is slowly coming back, but they're still nervous. So it's up to the Indigenous leaders and communities to provide a landing strip for investment and industry to come to the table so they could sit down and have a constructive conversation. And when I said to the leaders on Friday that if you're going to get to the table, and many of them have been around the block before, make sure you bring the best negotiator to the table. Because I'm going to tell you what's happening right now in some of the smaller communities that don't have the capacity. KC Energy or Enbridge. Some of these communities are coming to the table with the lack of capacity to negotiate a benefits agreement. And it's the industry that's trying to tell them to get a better deal. So that's a wake-up call for our community to make sure you have the expertise at the table. Because quite frankly, that's not industry's job to help you get a better deal. You're supposed to negotiate with industry, even though they've opened the door to make sure you can get the best deal possible. But make sure you got the best people at the table doing so. As my uncle once said, crap don't flow uphill and paydays on Friday. Money doesn't have tears. And you have to negotiate the best available opportunity that is in front of you. Even if you disagree being there, negotiate the best available benefits deal for your people. Because 9 out of 10 times these projects do not go ahead. And there's a lot of communities that have benefited. Now let's look to the Heisley. Great nation. Got to understand a lot of their trials and tribulations. Crystal's a very good friend. Alice. So many good people there. I don't need to tell you what it's done for their community. But what I said to the leaders, that if we continue to fight one another while addressing those difficult issues like overlap, rights and title, at least hear one another out and come to an understanding, because I know you can do it. They all agree. But if you don't, we will watch our neighbors once again prosper with another LNG facility while we sit and fight one another. The choice is yours, because at the end of the day, regardless of our differences, I've always believed that together we are stronger. We are a strong nation. We are a healthy nation. Indigenous communities are front and center in Canada, not just in Canada or the United States, but around the world. And I'm telling you, the first thing they keep asking, investment in industry, are the leaders aligned?
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. When asked about the scope and size of Port Edward LNG, CEO Chris Hilliard stated, "If LNG Canada is a walk-in freezer, Port Edward is a bar fridge. We're tiny, we're about 1% of the size of LNG Canada." Let us rejoin the conversation as Hilliard gives us an update on Port Edward LNG.
I am the president of Port Edward LNG. Some of you may have heard of that project. We are obviously very close by. I'm also a father of 5 and a grandfather of 3.5. So life is full, and my roots into this community stretch back quite a long ways. I in fact grew up in Burnaby, down the coast, but my grandfather, and by extension my father, spent nearly a decade in a little place called Antioch, which is relatively close by. Port Edward LNG is now nearly 2.5 years old. It is a small-scale LNG facility, and what I'll try and do today is give you a little sense of how we approached starting a new project. It's a small private company, only 4 stakeholders down in the coast. What we tried to do as we reached out to the local communities to bridge the gap between a commercial proponent and the folks who frankly live and work here. I'll also give you a little, at the end of the presentation, we'll have a little video which will give you a sense of what the project is and more precisely where it is. And also, very, very importantly, what it is not. It is not LNG Canada. As an LNG project goes, we are in fact approximately 1% the size of LNGC. So we are tiny. But tiny in the LNG world still means it's a pretty big project. When we started this, my business partners and I, the first thing we did was we bought a land parcel. It's about 37 acres, so that gives you an idea right out of the gate of scale. That land parcel is beside the BC Hydro facility and the Pacific Northern Gas metering station on Highway 16, just past the Port Edward turnoff. Once we had that land parcel, we asked ourselves the question, what do we do next? And the simple answer was we began to reach out to local communities. And we said, look, we don't have a business plan yet. We don't have a fully fledged idea. What we'd like to know is what you believe we should do. So that engagement started very quickly. Shortly thereafter, we found ourselves having to bid on pipeline capacity because a key tenet for a small-scale project is to use existing infrastructure wherever we can. So we are not building a new pipeline. We're using the existing Pacific Northern Gas pipeline that delivers natural gas to this entire community. And we're not building a new dock. We're not building a new dock and jetty. We will be moving LNG in small containers that will go through the Port of Prince Rupert. We then, a few months later, finally reached out to Victoria and went to the regulator. And we said, well, here we are. This is who we are. This is what we're proposing to do. And being government, not to slag government, but they said, well, you're going to have to reach out to various people. And we said, that's okay. We've already done that. And they said, well, there's so many. And we said, yeah, we think there are a lot more than that. So our active, proactive approach has always been to deal with we. We, who are the people who are here, need to work together. These are not necessarily simple commercial discussions. They are complicated, and sometimes they're frankly very hard. And you've heard that from Ellis, you've heard it from Crystal, you've heard it from others. Some of these commercial negotiations are tough, but they're the right thing to do, they're an important thing to do, and you have to drive through that. And frankly, the best thing the government can do is just stay out of the way.
Open Connection will be right back after these And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Site preparation is a fundamental part of the construction process and involves the removal of waste to ensure that the area or stretch of land is free of any hazards and work can start from a blank canvas. In this final segment of Open Connection, Chris Hilliard updates us on Port Edward LNG.
The biggest piece of work that we have to do for this small project is actually site preparation. The land parcel itself is really the side of Mount Stewart. And the rock wall that you see on the right-hand side there is actually about 22 meters high. That's a lot of work. It's about 12 months of site preparation and pretty big. In fact, it's the largest single contract that we will award. That rock face also serves a wonderful purpose in that it hides us away. So you won't actually see this facility from the roadway. And at all points, if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, as we move over the site, you will see that we are set back from the water. We are not touching the water. At all times, we remain 30 meters or more back, and all those trees remain in place. So we've done our best to also hide us from the water view. So if you're out in the water, you're actually really not going to see the plant, with the exception perhaps of some of the higher structures like the shrouded flare that you see there. Okay, if we continue. The white tanks that you see are our buffer storage that represents a couple of days of LNG. Not a big tank, as you would see with LNG Canada, that they've recently nearly completed. I suppose is probably the right technical term. As we move along, you see the piping that will carry the LNG. And if we pause right here, you can see 4 loading bays. So every day we will load individual 40-foot containers with LNG. And there will be many people in our industry who will say that doesn't make sense, the volumes are too small, you're moving a container from here to Asia, and then returning the empty container back. There's nothing you can put in that container to bring it back, so there's a lot of logistics there. The reality is, it does make sense, and it makes sense for a very particular reason. The buyers on the Chinese side, particularly China, although Japan and Korea perhaps, but the buyers on the Chinese side, this allows us to deliver to a container port very close to them. In some cases, these consumers are trucking LNG up to 200 kilometers, and we can deliver it to a dock that's about 20 kilometers away. That enables them to have lower emissions, lower trucking costs, and that is a positive outcome for all of us. In fact, just this week, there's a study been put out by a group called Wood Mackenzie, and if Canadian LNG was to be in full force, as it could be with the projects that are in view right now, the amount of displaced emissions in China alone would be the same as removing every single car from Canadian roads. It's a big number. So we really should move this forward on a global basis, and this particular delivery mechanism allows us to get to a customer in a unique way and solve some of their problems. So we load in those 4 bays 40 containers every single day.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.